The most dangerous mistake in a room full of powerful people is assuming you already know who matters. Rain traced silver lines across the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harbor Room, one of Seattle's most exclusive waterfront restaurants. Beyond the glass, harbor lights shimmered across the dark water while ferries moved slowly through the mist. Inside, warm golden light reflected off polished wood tables and crystal glasses. Emily Carter adjusted the navy apron tied around her waist and carried a tray of coffee toward a private dining room reserved for one of the restaurant's most important guests. She knew the name. Everyone did. Daniel Brooks, billionaire founder of Brooks Technologies. Investor, public speaker, single father, a man whose decisions could change the direction of entire companies. Most people became nervous around him. Emily simply focused on doing her job well. When she entered the room, the dinner was already underway. Executives in tailored suits discussed international business plans, while servers quietly moved between tables. Daniel sat near the center of the room. He looked exactly like the photographs that appeared in magazines, though somehow more tired. Not physically tired. The deeper kind. The kind that lingered behind someone's eyes. Beside him sat his 10-year-old daughter, Olivia. Unlike the adults, Olivia looked completely bored. She rested her chin in her hand and stared at a notebook lying beside her plate. Emily placed fresh coffee cups around the table. As she worked, fragments of conversation drifted through the room. Discussions about overseas partnerships, market expansion, international investors. Nothing unusual. Then the private dining room door opened. 2 Japanese investors entered with a company representative. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Handshakes were exchanged. Chairs moved. Polite introductions filled the room. Daniel welcomed the guests warmly before everyone settled back into their seats. Emily stepped aside near a service station, preparing to leave. But before she could, one of the Japanese investors leaned toward his colleague and quietly said something in Japanese. The second man responded. Then another comment followed. Soft, casual, private. None of the executives reacted. Most clearly assumed nobody else understood. Emily continued arranging cups without looking up. Across the table, Olivia absent-mindedly opened her notebook. Daniel reviewed documents in front of him. The conversation among the investors continued. A misunderstanding appeared to emerge regarding a schedule for the following day. One man looked confused. Another seemed concerned. The company representative attempted to clarify, but his explanation only appeared to make things worse. The room grew slightly uncomfortable. Daniel noticed the confusion but remained silent, allowing the translator to work through it. Emily lowered her eyes toward the coffee pot in her hands. She recognized every word, every sentence, every subtle cultural implication hidden beneath the conversation. Years of study had made the language feel natural, familiar, yet she said nothing. It was not her place. At least, that was what she told herself. Then one investor quietly made a remark that caused the other to misunderstand the entire situation. Emily froze for half a second. A single sentence. One small misunderstanding. But if left alone, it could affect the entire meeting. Around her, nobody seemed aware of it. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows as Emily stood motionless, holding the coffee pot, unaware that the next few moments were about to change the course of 3 lives forever. Emily remained perfectly still. The polished coffee pot felt heavier in her hands than it should have. Across the room, the Japanese investors continued their discussion. The misunderstanding was small, almost invisible. One phrase had been interpreted too literally. A scheduling request had quietly transformed into what sounded like a concern about commitment and reliability. The translator appeared confident, yet each explanation pushed the conversation slightly farther from its original meaning. Daniel noticed the growing hesitation between the guests. He closed the folder in front of him and listened more carefully. Beside him, Olivia sensed the tension even if she did not fully understand it. She looked from one face to another before lowering her eyes to her notebook again. Emily tried to walk away. She really did. For years, she had learned to stay invisible. Customers ordered meals. She delivered them. Important people held important conversations. She stayed outside those conversations. That was how the world worked. Yet another sentence drifted across the room. Then another. The confusion deepened. One investor politely apologized for what he believed was a scheduling conflict. The other began discussing alternative arrangements. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with his executives. Something was clearly wrong. The plans they had agreed upon earlier in the week were suddenly shifting direction. The translator attempted another explanation. This time the Japanese guests looked even less certain. Emily felt her stomach tighten. She knew exactly where the mistake had begun. She knew exactly how to fix it. Still she hesitated. Then Olivia accidentally knocked her pencil from the table. It rolled across the floor and stopped near Emily's feet. Emily bent down, picked it up, and handed it back with a smile. "Thank you," Olivia said. Emily nodded. Before she could stop herself, she glanced toward the investors and quietly spoke a single sentence in fluent Japanese. The room froze. Every conversation stopped. The sentence was simple, respectful, and precise. She explained that the original comment referred to arrival flexibility rather than uncertainty about participation. Nothing more. Nothing less. Silence followed. One investor blinked. Then the other smiled immediately. Relief spread across both faces. They responded in Japanese. Emily answered calmly. A brief exchange followed. Less than 30 seconds. When it ended, the misunderstanding had completely disappeared. The investors nodded appreciatively and returned their attention to Daniel. Around the table, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The translator stared at Emily. Several executives looked genuinely stunned. Olivia's mouth hung open. Daniel remained seated, but his eyes never left Emily. The Japanese investor nearest the window finally smiled and addressed Daniel in English. "Your waitress speaks." Beautiful Japanese. More silence. Emily suddenly wished the floor would open beneath her. She lowered her eyes. "I apologize if I interrupted." Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. For several seconds he said nothing at all. The rain continued tapping softly against the glass behind him. Then he asked the question that would change the entire evening. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "where exactly did you learn Japanese?" For a moment, nobody in the room seemed capable of speaking. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows overlooking the harbor, but inside the private dining room, the atmosphere had completely changed. Emily stood beside the table holding the coffee pot, wishing she could somehow disappear. Daniel Brooks remained focused on her. His question still hung in the air. "Where exactly did you learn Japanese?" Several executives turned in their seats. The translator watched her carefully. Even the Japanese investors seemed curious now. Olivia looked the most fascinated of all. Emily hesitated before answering. "Mostly by myself." The response only deepened the silence. One executive blinked. Another exchanged a confused look with the person beside him. Daniel leaned back slightly. "By yourself?" Emily nodded. "For the most part." One of the Japanese investors smiled politely. "Your pronunciation sounds natural. That usually takes years." Emily lowered her eyes. It did take years. Olivia immediately sat up straighter. "How many years?" Emily thought for a moment. "About 8. The young girl looked stunned. 8 years. Emily smiled. "Languages take patience." Daniel studied her expression. Nothing about her answers sounded exaggerated. Nothing sounded rehearsed. She simply stated facts. That somehow made the revelation more surprising. Richard Hale, one of Daniel's senior executives, folded his arms. 8 years is a long time for a hobby. Emily glanced toward him. "I suppose it is." Richard tilted his head. "Why Japanese?" The question seemed reasonable enough. Emily relaxed slightly. It was easier to answer than the others. "Because of a library book." Several people looked confused. Olivia smiled immediately. "That sounds like a story." Emily laughed softly. "Maybe." Daniel found himself unexpectedly interested. "Go on." Emily shifted the coffee pot onto the service tray beside her. "When I was 19, I found a book about Japanese education and culture at a public library." She paused. "I became curious." Olivia nodded as if that explained everything. Daniel noticed and smiled. Emily continued. "One book became 2, then 10, then 50. Several executives laughed quietly. Richard remained skeptical. "And eventually you taught yourself an entire language?" Emily shrugged slightly. "Not immediately." One of the Japanese investors smiled warmly. "That answer sounds very Japanese." The room laughed. Emily smiled too. Daniel noticed something important. She never tried to impress anyone. She never spoke like someone showing off knowledge. If anything, she seemed uncomfortable with the attention. That alone made him trust her more. Richard was not convinced. "You were telling us that a waitress learned advanced Japanese from library books?" The room grew quiet again. The wording felt sharper than necessary. Emily remained calm. Books, language recordings, online lectures, conversation groups. She smiled faintly. And a lot of mistakes. Olivia laughed. That sounds more realistic. Daniel glanced toward his daughter, then back toward Emily. The Japanese investors exchanged a few comments in Japanese. This time, Emily deliberately looked away, pretending not to hear. One investor noticed and smiled. Daniel noticed too. The gesture revealed something about her character. She understood the language, but she respected boundaries. Then one investor said something unexpected. May we ask her a question? Daniel looked surprised. Of course. The investor turned toward Emily and spoke entirely in Japanese. The sentence was longer, more complex, more nuanced. Several people around the table immediately realized this was no simple test. And for the first time all evening, every eye in the room focused completely on the quiet waitress standing beside the coffee station. The room became so quiet that even the gentle sound of rain against the harbor windows seemed louder than before. Emily felt every pair of eyes settle on her. The Japanese investor waited patiently for an answer to the question he had just asked. It was not a simple question. It contained cultural references, layered meanings, and subtle expressions that even many advanced language learners struggled to understand. Emily took a slow breath. Then she answered in Japanese. Her voice was calm and natural. There was no hesitation, no searching for words, no sign of performance. She simply spoke. One sentence became two. Two became five. The investor's expression changed almost immediately. Surprise appeared first, then amusement, then genuine admiration. His colleague joined the conversation. Emily responded again. The exchange continued for nearly a minute. Around the table, nobody understood what was being said except the Japanese guests. Yet everyone could see something important happening. The rhythm of the conversation felt effortless. The investors were no longer testing her. They were enjoying the discussion. Finally, the first investor laughed warmly and nodded. The second investor smiled and said something that made Emily laugh as well. When the conversation ended, both men looked genuinely impressed. Daniel leaned forward. What did they ask? Emily looked uncomfortable, becoming the center of attention. The first investor answered before she could. I asked her about a traditional Japanese saying regarding lifelong learning and humility. Daniel glanced toward Emily, and the investor smiled. Her answer was better than mine. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. Richard Hale frowned slightly. He clearly disliked how quickly the room's attention had shifted. What exactly did she say? Richard asked. The investor folded his hands. She said knowledge is not something a person owns. It is something a person borrows for a while and then shares. Silence followed. Olivia's eyes widened. Daniel remained motionless. Even Richard seemed unsure how to respond. The investor continued. Then she explained the cultural history behind the saying. He shook his head with admiration. Very accurately. Emily wished everyone would return to discussing business. She had spent years studying quietly without expecting recognition. Standing in front of powerful executives felt unnatural. Daniel noticed her discomfort. That made him even more curious. Most people would have enjoyed the attention. Emily seemed eager to escape it. Olivia smiled brightly. That is beautiful. Emily looked toward the young girl and smiled back. I think so too. Daniel found himself studying Emily the way he might study an unexpected solution to a difficult problem. Nothing about her fit the assumptions everyone had made when she entered the room carrying coffee. Yet the evidence sat directly in front of him. Fluency, knowledge, humility, confidence without arrogance. The combination was rare. Richard finally leaned back in his chair. That is impressive, he admitted. Then a faint smile appeared on his face. But now I am curious. Emily immediately sensed a challenge coming. Richard folded his arms. If you really know Japanese culture as well as everyone thinks, perhaps we should ask a few more questions. Across the table, Daniel quietly watched. Olivia sat forward with excitement. The investors exchanged interested glances. And for the first time all evening, Emily realized that the conversation was only beginning. Emily felt the attention in the room shift again. The earlier surprise had transformed into curiosity. Richard Hale was no longer merely skeptical. He was interested. That, somehow, felt more dangerous. Curious people asked questions. Skeptical people looked for weaknesses. Richard seemed prepared to do both. The executive rested his arms on the table and offered a polite smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Nothing unfair," he said. "I am simply fascinated." Several people around the table laughed softly. Emily smiled politely, but remained cautious. Daniel watched the exchange without interrupting. Olivia looked delighted. To her, the evening had suddenly become far more interesting than any business dinner could have been. Richard turned toward the Japanese investors. "Would either of you mind helping?" The investors exchanged amused glances and agreed. One of them asked Emily a question in Japanese. This time the topic was not language itself. It was history. Emily answered calmly. The investor nodded with approval. A second question followed. This one involved cultural traditions and social etiquette. Emily answered again. Another nod. Another smile. Richard leaned back slightly. The room began noticing a pattern. Each question grew more difficult. Each answer arrived with the same quiet confidence. Emily never rushed. She never tried to sound impressive. She simply responded. The Japanese guests seemed increasingly entertained by the entire situation. One executive whispered something to a colleague. Another shook his head in disbelief. Olivia watched Emily with complete admiration. Then Richard decided to change directions. "Let me ask something different," he said. Emily looked toward him. Richard folded his hands. "Most people study a language because they plan to travel, work overseas, or build a career around it." He paused. "You became a waitress." The room grew quieter. The question sounded innocent enough, but everyone recognized what sat beneath it. If Emily possessed this much knowledge, why was she serving coffee instead of working in an international organization? Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. He did not like the tone of the question. Emily remained calm. She had heard variations of it before. Life does not always follow the plans we make. Richard smiled. Fair answer. But he continued. You must have had other ambitions. Emily glanced toward the harbor lights beyond the rain-covered glass. For a moment, she seemed far away. Then she nodded. I did. Olivia spoke before anyone else could. What were they? Emily smiled softly. I wanted to become a teacher. Something about the answer changed the atmosphere immediately. There was no dramatic ambition, no dream of wealth, no story about fame, just a teacher. Olivia's expression brightened. Daniel noticed it. So did Emily. Richard seemed surprised. What happened? Emily hesitated. The question touched a place she rarely discussed. The room waited. Finally, she answered. My mother became sick. No further explanation was necessary. The simplicity of the sentence carried its own weight. Silence settled across the table. Even. Richard looked uncomfortable. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. He understood sacrifice. He understood how quickly life could rewrite a person's plans. Outside, rain continued falling across the harbor. Inside, nobody seemed interested in testing Emily anymore. Yet Daniel sensed that the most important part of her story had not been revealed. Not even close. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The quiet that followed Emily's answer felt different from the earlier surprise. Before, the room had been impressed. Now it was listening. Daniel looked toward the rain-covered windows and then back at Emily. He recognized something familiar in the way she had spoken. There had been no self-pity in her voice. No attempt to gain sympathy. Just a simple truth. Life had changed direction, and she had adapted. Olivia rested her elbows carefully on the table. Did your mother get better? She asked softly. Emily smiled. It was a gentle smile, touched with both gratitude and memory. Eventually, yes. Olivia smiled back. That is good. Emily nodded. It is. The young girl thought for a moment. So you stopped college? I did. And you kept studying anyway? Emily laughed quietly. I could not seem to stop. Several people around the table smiled. Daniel noticed that Emily spoke about learning the same way other people spoke about family or old friends. There was affection in her voice. Richard remained thoughtful. The challenge had slowly disappeared from his expression. Curiosity had replaced it. You spent 8 years teaching yourself Japanese while working? He asked. Emily nodded. Most of the time. Why? Richard asked. You were no longer in school. Emily considered the question carefully. Because learning made the difficult years feel smaller. The answer settled over the room. Nobody seemed to expect it. Daniel certainly had not. Emily continued before anyone could respond. When my mother was sick, there were many things I could not control. Hospital visits, bills, fear. Her voice remained calm. But I could still learn something new each day. Olivia listened closely. Even the executives appeared absorbed now. Emily glanced toward the notebook sitting beside Olivia's plate. A new word, a new idea, a new chapter in a book. She smiled. Progress is comforting when life feels uncertain. One of the Japanese investors nodded immediately. Very true. Daniel found himself staring at the coffee cup in front of him. He had spent years solving billion-dollar problems. Yet lately, after losing his wife, there had been days when he felt as though he was simply moving forward because people expected him to. Emily's words reached a place he rarely discussed. Olivia suddenly opened her notebook and turned several pages. "Can you read this?" she asked. Emily stepped closer. The page contained handwritten Japanese phrases, copied carefully by a child still learning basic vocabulary. Emily smiled. Of course. Olivia brightened immediately. Emily read each line slowly and clearly. Then she explained the meanings. Olivia listened with complete concentration. Daniel watched the exchange. Something about it felt remarkably natural. Emily never spoke down to the girl. She treated every question as worthy of respect. After several minutes, Olivia looked up with excitement. "You would make a really good teacher." The compliment seemed to catch Emily off guard. For the first time that evening, genuine emotion flickered across her face. Just for a second. Then she smiled. "Thank you." Daniel noticed it. So did Olivia. Neither realized it yet, but a door that had been closed for years had just begun to open. The compliment lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Emily looked down at Olivia's notebook as if the pages might help her avoid the attention. Yet something had changed. The room no longer saw a waitress who happened to know another language. They were beginning to see the person behind the apron. Olivia closed the notebook carefully and smiled. "I mean it." Emily laughed softly. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me this week." Olivia looked pleased with herself. Daniel watched the exchange quietly. For the first time that evening, he noticed how relaxed his daughter seemed. Most business dinners left her restless and impatient. Tonight, she looked completely engaged. Curious. Energized. It reminded him of how she used to look when her mother read stories to her before bed. The realization caught him off guard. One of the Japanese investors smiled at Olivia. "You ask very good questions." Olivia grinned. "Emily gives interesting answers." Laughter spread around the table. Even Richard smiled. The tension that had filled the room earlier was gone. In its place was something unexpected. Genuine conversation. Emily returned to the service station to refill water glasses. She assumed the evening would finally return to business. Instead, Olivia followed her. "Can I ask one more thing?" Emily smiled. "Only one." Olivia laughed. "Maybe three." Daniel shook his head from across the table. "That sounds more accurate." Olivia ignored him completely. What was the hardest part about learning Japanese? Emily considered the question. Being bad at it. Olivia blinked. "Really?" Emily nodded. "Most people want to be good at something immediately." Several executives quietly listened. Emily continued while filling a glass of water. "Learning a language means making mistakes every day." "Did that bother you?" Olivia asked. Emily smiled. "At first. Then I realized mistakes are proof that you are learning." Daniel looked down at the table. The sentence struck him harder than he expected. Over the years, he had built a company that celebrated success. Yet failure had always frightened people. Employees hid mistakes. Managers avoided risks. Entire meetings were designed around appearing certain. Emily's perspective felt strangely refreshing. One of the Japanese investors nodded. "That is also very Japanese thinking." Richard leaned forward. "How so?" The investor smiled. "Improvement matters more than perfection." Daniel sat quietly. The phrase settled into his thoughts. Improvement matters more than perfection. It sounded simple. Yet he could not remember the last time anyone had said something that honest during a board meeting. Olivia looked delighted. "I like that." Emily nodded. "So do I." The young girl hesitated before asking another question. "Do you still want to be a teacher?" The room became quiet again. Emily stopped moving for a moment. The question seemed simple, but Daniel immediately sensed its weight. Emily looked toward the harbor lights beyond the rain-streaked glass. For a few seconds, nobody interrupted her thoughts. Finally, she answered, "Yes." The single word carried years inside it. Years of sacrifice. Years of responsibility. Years of putting other people first. Olivia smiled immediately. "Then I think you should." Emily laughed softly. Yet Daniel noticed something behind her smile. Hope. Small. Careful. Almost forgotten. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he suddenly found himself wondering why someone with that much talent was still standing behind a coffee station instead of standing in a classroom. The question remained suspended between them. Do you still want to be a teacher? Emily had answered honestly. Yes. Yet after speaking the word aloud, she felt something unexpected. Vulnerability. Some dreams become easier to carry when nobody asks about them. They remain safely hidden where disappointment cannot reach them. Olivia, however, seemed completely unaware of such complications. Then why not do it? She asked. Emily laughed softly. Around the table, several adults smiled. Children had a remarkable talent for making difficult problems sound simple. Emily placed a water pitcher back onto the service station and considered her answer. Because wanting something and being able to do it are not always the same thing. Olivia frowned thoughtfully. I guess. Daniel watched his daughter process the idea. He could almost see the questions forming in her mind. What happened after your mother got better? Olivia asked. Emily looked down at her hands for a moment. The answer carried years inside it. Life kept moving. The room remained quiet. Nobody seemed interested in returning to business discussions anymore. Emily continued. The hospital bills did not disappear. The rent did not disappear. Responsibilities did not disappear. She smiled gently. Sometimes survival becomes the full-time job. Daniel felt the truth of the statement immediately. Not because of money. His life had never lacked resources. But after losing his wife, there had been mornings when simply getting through the day felt like enough. One of the Japanese investors nodded slowly. Many people understand that feeling. Emily appreciated the kindness in his voice. She glanced toward the rain-covered harbor outside the windows. I told myself I would go back someday. Olivia smiled. You still can. Emily laughed again. You make everything sound easy. Maybe adults make everything sound too hard, Olivia replied. The room erupted in laughter. Even Richard could not help smiling. Daniel shook his head. That sounds exactly like something your mother would have said. Olivia's smile softened. The mention of her mother created a brief silence. Daniel looked away toward the windows. Emily noticed the change immediately. She recognized grief when it appeared. Sometimes it arrived loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly through a single sentence. This time it arrived through a father's eyes. The conversation shifted naturally. One of the executives asked Emily how she had maintained her Japanese skills over so many years. Emily seemed relieved by the practical question. Reading, she answered. Listening. Writing. Practicing whenever possible. Richard looked genuinely curious now. Even while working full-time? Emily nodded. Especially while working full-time. Several people laughed. She smiled. Learning became part of my routine. 15 minutes here. 30 minutes there. Olivia looked amazed. That does not sound like much. Emily shook her head. Most big things are built from small things. Daniel slowly repeated the sentence in his mind. Most big things are built from small things. It sounded obvious. Yet he realized that nearly every meaningful achievement in his own life had begun exactly that way. Small decisions repeated consistently. The rain outside had begun to slow. Harbor lights reflected across the water like scattered gold. Inside the private dining room, nobody seemed eager for the evening to end. And as Daniel listened to Emily speak, he found himself wondering whether the most valuable lesson in the room that night had nothing to do with business at all. The conversation should have returned to contracts, projections, and investment strategies. Instead, everyone remained focused on Emily. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Earlier in the evening, she had been part of the background. Now she occupied the center of a discussion she never intended to join. Daniel found himself listening more closely than he had listened during most executive meetings that month. Olivia leaned forward eagerly. What was the most important thing you learned from studying Japanese? She asked. Emily smiled. It was the kind of question she loved because there was no single correct answer. She glanced toward the harbor beyond the windows. The rain had almost stopped now. Reflections danced across the dark water. There is a Japanese idea I think about often, she said. It helped me through difficult years. Olivia immediately looked intrigued. Several executives did as well. One of the Japanese investors smiled knowingly. Emily continued. The idea is that a person should remain a student for life. Richard nodded. That sounds simple. It is, Emily replied. And it is not. The room grew quiet again. Emily spoke carefully, choosing her words. Many people think learning ends when school ends. She shook her head. But life keeps teaching whether we are paying attention or not. Daniel felt something in that sentence. Something uncomfortable. Something true. Emily continued. The people who keep growing are usually the people who keep asking questions. Olivia smiled immediately. I ask a lot of questions. Laughter spread around the table. You certainly do, Daniel said. Emily smiled. That is a good thing. One executive raised an eyebrow. Even as an adult? Especially as an adult, Emily answered. She looked around the room. Children ask questions because they want to understand the world. Adults often stop asking because they want to appear knowledgeable. Silence followed. The observation landed harder than expected. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. Around the table sat executives responsible for thousands of employees. Brilliant people. Accomplished people. Yet how many of them still approached life with genuine curiosity? The answer made him uncomfortable. One of the Japanese investors nodded enthusiastically. That philosophy is deeply respected in Japan. Emily smiled. I think it should be respected everywhere. Olivia looked thoughtful. So what happens when people stop learning? Emily considered the question. They become trapped inside the version of themselves they already know. Nobody spoke. Even Richard remained silent. Daniel stared at the coffee cup in front of him. Trapped inside the version of themselves they already know. The sentence echoed in his mind. Since losing his wife, he had focused on responsibility. Running the company. Raising Olivia. Meeting expectations. Surviving. But somewhere along the way, curiosity had disappeared from his life. Growth had become maintenance. Progress had become routine. Emily had no idea what effect her words were having. She simply spoke honestly. Learning does not always change your circumstances immediately, she said. Sometimes it changes your perspective first. Daniel looked up. Their eyes met briefly. Emily looked away almost immediately, unaware that she had just articulated something he desperately needed to hear. Outside, the clouds were beginning to break. Inside, a conversation that started with a language had quietly become something much larger. And for the first time in years, Daniel found himself asking a question he had not considered in a very long time. What if he still had something left to learn? The question lingered quietly in Daniel's mind long after the conversation should have ended. What if he still had something left to learn? The thought felt strangely unfamiliar. For years, people had come to him for answers. Investors wanted guidance. Executives wanted direction. Employees wanted certainty. Somewhere along the way, he had become accustomed to being the person who explained things rather than the person who asked questions. Emily, without realizing it, had disrupted that pattern. The private dining room had grown calmer. Business documents remained scattered across the table, yet nobody seemed eager to discuss projections anymore. The evening had taken a different path. Olivia closed her notebook and looked between Emily and her father. Dad used to ask a lot more questions. Daniel looked surprised. I did. Olivia nodded. When Mom was here, the room became still. Emily immediately lowered her eyes. Several executives glanced away respectfully. Daniel sat quietly for a moment. The mention of his wife rarely happened in public. Not because people had forgotten her, because they were afraid of causing pain. Olivia, however, was 10 years old. She simply spoke honestly. Daniel smiled faintly. You are probably right. Olivia leaned forward. You used to ask about everything. Daniel looked toward the harbor lights beyond the windows. Reflections shimmered across the dark water. Your mother was very curious, he said softly. Curiosity is contagious when you spend enough time around someone. Emily listened quietly while organizing glasses on a nearby tray. She sensed that this conversation mattered. Daniel's expression softened. She never stopped learning. Books, languages, history, music. He smiled at the memory. Sometimes I thought she asked questions simply because she enjoyed discovering new answers. Olivia smiled. I do that too. Daniel laughed gently. Yes, you definitely do. The room relaxed again. Yet something deeper remained beneath the conversation. Emily recognized it. Grief never completely disappeared. It simply learned how to sit quietly beside a person. One of the Japanese investors spoke thoughtfully. In Japan, there is a belief that loss can sometimes deepen appreciation. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand that. Then, unexpectedly, he looked toward Emily. You mentioned that learning changed your perspective before it changed your circumstances. Emily paused. She remembered saying it. Yes. Daniel folded his hands. How? The question carried genuine curiosity. Not the curiosity of an executive evaluating someone. The curiosity of a person searching for something. Emily considered her answer carefully. When life became difficult, I spent a lot of time focusing on what I had lost. The room remained silent. Opportunities. Plans. Time. She smiled softly. Learning reminded me to notice what still remained. Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. Emily continued. The future remained. Possibility remained. Growth remained. Nobody spoke. Even Richard listened closely. Emily glanced toward Olivia. Hope is easier to keep when you believe tomorrow can teach you something new. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. The sentence reached him more deeply than he expected. For years he had focused on responsibility, survival, stability. But hope was different. Hope required imagination. Hope required believing that the future might contain something worth discovering. Outside, the clouds finally began to break apart above the harbor. A faint stretch of moonlight appeared across the water. Inside the restaurant, Daniel Brooks realized that a waitress carrying coffee had quietly given him something no executive, consultant, or advisor had managed to provide in years. A new way of looking forward. The evening was beginning to wind down, though nobody seemed eager to leave. Empty coffee cups sat beside forgotten business documents. The Japanese investors appeared relaxed. The executives looked thoughtful. Even Richard Hale, who had spent the beginning of the dinner testing Emily's knowledge, now listened with genuine respect. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. Moonlight shimmered across the harbor, turning the dark water into moving silver. Emily quietly resumed her work. She collected plates, refilled glasses, and restored the rhythm she understood best. Part of her hoped the attention would finally fade. Another part of her knew something unusual had happened. She simply did not know what it meant yet. Olivia watched her for several moments before speaking again. Do you ever teach anyone? Emily looked surprised. Not officially. Olivia tilted her head. But you taught me things tonight. Emily smiled. That is different. Why? Olivia asked. Emily laughed softly. Because it only lasted a few minutes. Olivia seemed unconvinced. It still counts. Daniel smiled at his daughter. Sometimes children recognize truths that adults complicated unnecessarily. One of the Japanese investors nodded toward Emily. Teaching is not always a profession. He paused thoughtfully. Sometimes it is simply what a person naturally does. The comment settled over the room. Emily felt herself becoming embarrassed again. I think you are all being very generous. Richard shook his head. No, we are being observant. The response surprised even him. Daniel noticed it and smiled faintly. The evening had changed more than one person's perspective. A few minutes later, the investors began gathering their documents. Meetings had schedules. Flights had departure times. The practical world was slowly returning. Handshakes were exchanged. Final details were confirmed. Yet before the guests left, the older investor approached Emily directly. He handed her a simple business card. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just a card. If you ever visit Tokyo, he said, there is a language academy on this card. Emily accepted it politely. Thank you. The investor smiled. They appreciate people who love learning as much as you do. Emily looked down at the card. For a moment, she could not find words. It was not a job offer. It was not a promise. Yet somehow it felt important. A reminder that possibilities still existed. Daniel watched the exchange carefully. He noticed the way Emily held the card. Carefully, respectfully, almost as if she were afraid to hope too much. The investors finally departed. One by one, the executives followed. Soon only a handful of people remained in the private dining room. The harbor lights reflected quietly across the windows. Olivia gathered her notebook and slipped it into her backpack. Then she walked toward Emily. I'm glad you answered that question. Emily smiled. Which question? Olivia grinned. The first one. The Japanese one. Emily laughed softly. Me too. Olivia hesitated. Then she hugged her notebook against her chest and said something that made Daniel pause. I think Mom would have liked you. The room became still. Emily looked at the young girl. Daniel looked away briefly toward the water. Neither expected the comment. Yet somehow it felt sincere. Honest. Gentle. Emily smiled softly. I would have liked meeting her too. And as silence settled once more across the room, Daniel realized that this evening was no longer simply a memorable business dinner. It had become the beginning of something neither of them had planned. After Olivia's words, the room seemed to settle into a quieter kind of silence. Not uncomfortable. Not awkward. Just thoughtful. The harbor lights reflected across the windows while the last traces of rain disappeared from the glass. Emily stood beside the table holding the business card the Japanese investor had given her. She had slipped it carefully into her apron pocket, though she still found herself touching the edge of it occasionally, almost to confirm it was real. Daniel noticed. The gesture reminded him of someone protecting a possibility. The remaining executives eventually excused themselves, leaving only Daniel, Olivia, and Emily in the private dining room. Staff members quietly cleaned other sections of the restaurant. The evening was clearly ending, yet Daniel found himself reluctant to leave. Olivia sat swinging one foot beneath her chair. "You should call them," she said suddenly. Emily looked confused. "Who?" "The Language Academy." Emily smiled. "Maybe." Olivia shook her head immediately. "Not maybe." Daniel laughed softly. "You inherited your persistence from your mother." Olivia grinned. "I know." Emily folded a napkin absent-mindedly while considering the suggestion. Sometimes opportunities belong to other people. Daniel looked up. "What makes you think that?" Emily hesitated. She had not intended to say the thought aloud. "I do not know." She offered a small smile. "Maybe because enough time passes and you stop expecting certain things." Daniel studied her expression. There it was again. The same careful distance she placed between herself and hope. Not bitterness. Not regret. Just caution. The kind developed by people who had learned not to depend on good news. Daniel leaned back slightly. "Can I ask you something?" Emily nodded. "Of course." "If nothing stood in your way," he said, "what would you do?" The question caught her off guard. She looked toward the harbor lights beyond the windows. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she answered honestly, "I would teach." Olivia smiled immediately, as if she had expected no other answer. Daniel nodded. "What kind of teaching?" Emily thought for a moment. "Languages. Culture. International education." Her voice became more animated as she spoke. "Helping people discover places they have never seen. Helping them realize the world is bigger than they imagined." Daniel noticed the change instantly. The uncertainty disappeared. The hesitation disappeared. For the first time all evening, Emily sounded exactly like someone describing her future rather than her past. Daniel exchanged a glance with Olivia. The young girl saw it too. A few moments later, Daniel reached into his briefcase and removed a folder. Emily looked surprised. "What is that?" Daniel opened it carefully. 3 months ago, my company launched a foundation initiative." Emily listened. "The program focuses on education, language access, and international learning opportunities for students who otherwise would not have them." Her eyes widened slightly. Daniel continued. "We have funding. We have schools. We have partnerships." He paused. "What we do not have is someone leading the educational development side." Emily stared at him. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Olivia smiled so widely that she could barely contain herself. Daniel slid a business card across the table. "This is not a job offer." Emily looked confused. Daniel smiled. "Not yet." He folded his hands. "But I would like you to meet with our foundation team next week." Emily looked from the card to Daniel and then to Olivia. For a moment, she could not speak. Years of carefully lowered expectations collided with a possibility she had never imagined. And somewhere beyond the harbor windows, beneath the clearing Seattle sky, a door she thought had closed forever quietly began to open. 1 year later, sunlight poured through the glass walls of a conference center overlooking Seattle's waterfront. The harbor looked different on a clear spring morning. Ferries crossed bright blue water. Seagulls drifted above the docks. Inside the main auditorium, hundreds of educators, nonprofit leaders, students, and international partners filled the seats. A large screen displayed photographs from language programs operating in schools across the country. At the center of the stage stood Emily Carter. She no longer wore a navy apron. Instead, she wore a simple professional suit and held a small presentation remote in one hand. Yet the calm expression in her eyes remained exactly the same. She looked out across the audience and smiled. The applause gradually faded. Then she began speaking, not about herself, not about achievements, not about titles. She spoke about students, about curiosity, about opportunity, about the life-changing power of believing that learning should belong to everyone. The audience listened closely. Some took notes. Others simply watched. Her words carried the same quiet sincerity that had filled a private dining room a year earlier. Several rose from the stage, Daniel Brooks sat beside Olivia. Neither of them missed a single word. Olivia was taller now. Her Japanese notebook rested on her lap, filled with pages of new vocabulary and handwritten notes. She had continued studying. Emily had made sure of that. As the presentation continued, photographs appeared on the screen behind her. Students participating in cultural exchange programs. Virtual language classrooms connecting children across continents. Community education projects funded through the Brooks Foundation. Programs that had not existed a year ago. Programs Emily helped build. Daniel watched the audience react. He felt proud, but not because the programs were successful. He felt proud because someone had finally been given the chance she deserved. Olivia leaned closer and whispered, "I told you she should be a teacher." Daniel laughed softly. "You did." Olivia smiled triumphantly. "I was right. You usually remind me when you are." Olivia grinned. On stage, Emily concluded her presentation with a story about a student who believed opportunities belonged to other people. The audience smiled knowingly. Emily paused for a moment before speaking her final words. Sometimes the biggest change in a person's life begins when someone sees potential they can no longer see themselves. Silence settled across the auditorium. Then applause erupted. People rose from their seats. The standing ovation continued for nearly a minute. Emily looked overwhelmed. She thanked the audience and stepped away from the podium. As she exited the stage, her eyes found Daniel and Olivia. The three exchanged smiles that required no explanation. A year earlier, they had been strangers connected only by a chance conversation and a language few people in the room understood. Now they were connected by something far greater. Not luck, not circumstance, possibility. Outside, sunlight danced across the harbor water. Inside, Emily carried the same business card she had received that rainy evening, tucked safely inside her notebook as a reminder. Because sometimes a single question changes a conversation. Sometimes a single conversation changes a life. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who teaches everyone else how to see the future again.